Good afternoon, I'm Richard. I live here locally, and I'd like to welcome everybody here that wanted to hear about the Apple II, including my family. Thank you for coming. In case you're wondering what I was doing 50 years ago, now maybe you'll find out. Okay, so let's get on with things. I first met Karen and Lonnie Mimms probably 10 years ago when part of the collection was set up at the CompUSA location, just off exit 7. So they had something called an Apple II pop-up for people who were interested in Apple IIs. I showed up and got to know what the Mimms people were all about. Now look at the Mimms people. Can you imagine what this is really phenomenal? You know, for those of us who have sort of an interest in vintage technology, what a place this is. This is really incredible. Fifth question first. How many of you actually owned Apple IIs? 1, 2. Okay, 2 people owned Apple IIs. Beck, I didn't know you owned one. Cool.
All through college.
Oh, good. Okay. Don't ask too many questions, okay?
Okay.
Okay. So it looks like I'm in pretty decent company here. Those of you who own Apple IIs and are into computer engineering are certainly sort of grateful and perhaps a bit awed for things that we have here. I did want to mention that one of the things that Apple is known for is that they're known for recycling items. Big on this. Well, last year at this time, I gave a couple of things to one of my family members, thank you, Lisa, who went to the Apple store in Avalon and recycled my iPhone 6 from 10 years ago and a vintage iPad. And you know, I understand that the staff there, the Gen Z staff, who'd never really seen anything older than 10 years old, was really amazed at what I brought in or what a family member brought in. Well, I wonder what they would have thought if instead I would have brought in this. This was my Apple II. And 49 years old, if I'd have brought that in for recycling, they would have probably oohed and awed. Actually, I did recycle the Apple II. It's now sitting in the Mimms Museum. It's part of the museum now. They own it. But I thought I would give you some idea of what I did with the Apple II when I had it and how it relates to the other computing technology of 50 years ago. Well, a lot of Apple IIs were sold. Apple sold enough of them to give every man, woman, and child in Fulton County and the 10 counties surrounding us an Apple II. It's a lot of Apple IIs. They did it over 16 years between 1977 and 1993. Well, what's different about the Apple II that I had? Well, it was actually known at the time, well, known now, as probably the holy grail of Apple IIs. It was one of the few Apple IIs that were referred to as Rev 0 units, reversion 0. So this was one of the very first units that was manufactured. Now Steve Wozniak, who we can't call Woz all the time, we don't bother with Steve Wozniak, he was the engineer who designed the Apple II. And he made many changes over the Apple II over the first years of production. The Rev 0 units are those that were made before he made significant changes. In other words, they were almost as original as you can get. So if you were to see an Apple II and popped open the covers, how would you know if it was a Rev 0 unit or not? Well, One of the ways that you would know as if it's a Rev 0 unit is to take a look at the main printed circuit board of the unit. This is a photo of half of the printed circuit board. And if you take a close look at it, it's pretty obvious the green thing sitting in the middle. Those were accessory slots so you could plug things into to expand the capabilities of the computer. In Rev 0 units, these slots are green, like this color. In newer units, they were really a dark green or almost a black. So this is one way you could tell this is a Rev 0 unit. The other way you could tell is take a look at the number in the top left-hand corner. At the time, Apple was putting serial numbers on the computers that were sequentially numbered, one right after the other. And this is the sequential numbering of the Apple computer boards for the Rev 0 units. After Rev 0, they no longer did this. They had a code of when it was manufactured. Well, the board that you see here was a photograph I got off the web, is actually somewhat newer than my unit. My unit had serial number 1145. This is out of 6 million computers. Yes, it was early. So if you plot the Apple growth of over time from when it was first started till the time it was ended, so I was pretty much at the beginning of the curve of Apple II, probably made in September of 1977, only maybe 3 short months after the Apple was first introduced. Well, Lonnie Mimms has owned many Apple II computers over the years. I understand he's been collecting computers for 4 decades. So what makes the Apple II that I had any different than all the others? Well, if you take a look at my computer and compare it with this computer, which is not mine, by the way, and the one around the corner in the hall, mine doesn't look quite as nice. It's obvious mine is pretty well used. It's not one of the more pristine computers, and it's certainly not museum worthy, but it's here anyway. Well, if you take a look at it, you can see that it was used. It was well used. And maybe the reason that it's here is because of how it was used. So let me tell you a few things about how it was used. No, I was not one of the first generation computer gamers. I never even owned any computer games, believe it or not. I used it for other things. So what were the other things I used it for? Well, in the simplest terms, analytical chemistry. How does analytical chemistry relate to an Apple II? Well, let me tell you about it. I was an analytical chemist for 45 years. And for 37 of those years, I worked for this company. Some of you may know, if you were in engineering and early computer technology, may know the name PerkinElmer. PerkinElmer made instrumentation for chemical laboratories. And it was certainly the world's leader at this period of time, 50 years ago, for scientific instruments. I worked for them as a chemist in the product development labs for 37 years. Well, I'm not going to say too much about analytical chemistry here. I worked in an area that's often known as atomic spectroscopy. It's 3 product lines that did this, analyzed chemical elements and how much iron, for example, is in a sample, or how much zinc is in a sample. And so worked for common elements like this. A lot of you have been reading about rare earths, for example, over the last couple of years. You would also use the instrumentation that PerkinElmer manufactured and that I worked with for the analysis of rare earths, elements like neodymium and praseodymium and samarium and other things that you can't pronounce. This was routine for me. Well, I wanted to show you what some of the instrumentation actually looks like that I worked with for a long time. This was the instrument model that I worked with when I started with the company in 1972. I was really tickled when I saw this photograph on the web, pulled it down. See the chemist, white shirt and tie beneath the lab coat. This was the dress code in the 1970s, even if you're in the lab at home, alone, working without anybody else around. My tie didn't come off till probably the mid-1990s. It's a bit different now, isn't it? Well, what did I do with this, and how did I use the instrumentation? Well, my job with the company was to develop the chemical methods that our customers used for to do the analysis, apply it to new elements, apply it to new different types of samples. But after a while, I also started working on developing algorithms. How do you process the data generated by the instrument? And then how do you display it to the customer? And how does the customer interact with the instruments that were generating this data? Well, periodically, on a weekend, a light bulb would go off. While I was mowing the lawn, I'd get a bright idea. And because I worked with computers all day, I wanted to have some way of actually trying some ideas out on the weekend before I got to the lab on Monday morning. Well, this was the mid-70s, and these hobbyist computers that we all heard about at the time, if you were my age, were being developed. If you take a look at some of them right outside the hall there, you'd see some examples of them. You know, the Altair, for example, the MSI, there were quite a few others. One of the problems I had with these is that it took engineering to get these to operate. I wasn't an engineer. I was not a computer programmer, even though I programmed. I was a chemist. So these were actually interesting to me. I wish I had access to it, but it wasn't really something I could use. If I couldn't just plug something into the wall, I wasn't interested. Well, in 1977, I saw this ad in Byte magazine. That computer looks like it could do something. Okay, it's called Apple. It's probably not real, but let's take a look at it. So I took a close look at the specifications, studied them closely, said, well, maybe this is something I could use. Well, I spent another 3 or 4 months studying everything I could about the Apple II, trying to decide, do I really want to spend money on this or not? Well, then I saw an ad in the local newspaper. A Computerland store was opening up in Fairfield, Connecticut, and this was 25 miles from where I lived. Well, guess who was the first person in the front door on the opening day? Walked in the door, I spent 3 hours there, walked out again, was back the following week, I spent another hour, and when I walked out the door, I had an Apple II under my arm. So, okay, this was a real, let me make this thing work. What did I do with it? Well, worked with it for a while, trying to get acquainted with it, but after about a year after I'd had the Apple II, Apple introduced Apple Pascal, programming language. It was actually the same programming language I was working with the IBM mainframes I worked with at work. So what did this mean? This meant if I got this bright idea at home, I could try it out on the computer, on my own computer, sitting in my den, and see what worked and what didn't, then take the same code, modify it a little bit, and try it out on what I was doing professionally at work. So this was, and as I said, I'm not really a computer programmer. I wasn't then. Yes, I could program, but then I would specify what functions the algorithm had to do, what the instrument had to do, turn those words over to the computer engineers and programmers who then made it work and introduced it into real products. Well, one of the problems we were having with the instrumentation at the time, it was getting so good at generating data. You know, I have had a problem with what do you do with all these numbers? Well, when this product was introduced that you see here, VisiCalc, the first digital spreadsheet, I was one of the first customers who bought it because this gave me a chance to see how do you handle a lot of data in a computer and how do you display it on the screen. So this gave me ideas on the user interaction that you could do with instrumentation to work with large quantities of numbers. So if you look at what I didn't do and what I did do with the Apple, what I didn't do any gaming. I did not do any teaching. Yes, Apple was really big on promoting the Apple II for teaching. I didn't do any of this. I certainly didn't do any accounting. But what I did was develop algorithms and develop user interface concepts that we could apply with the instrumentation that we were developing and then selling to customers. So in a way, I use the Apple II to inspire me. This is a terminology that the Mimms Museum is using to promote the 50 years of Apple that you'll be hearing a lot about in the next month or two. So the Apple II was an inspiration, and this was certainly true for me. Well, if you've been interested in vintage computers over the years, you certainly read a lot of articles on the significance of Apple II. What difference did it make to the computer world, to accountants primarily, to teaching? So you could read a lot of different stories about the significance of the Apple II. But what I want to do is tell you about a couple of cases that may be things that you hadn't thought of before. Some of you who are engineers may recognize this, the IBM 1620. When I was going to college, I was a chemist. I was studying chemistry. But I had an idea in my head, one of these years, there'll be a computer in there somewhere. So when the university offered their first course in scientific computer programming, using a programming language called Fortran, I jumped at the chance to take it. Well, this is when I became acquainted with the IBM 1620. Well, I should clarify that a little bit maybe. Yes, I was acquainted with it, but I never once in my 2 semesters of computer science actually saw the computer. Only the professor and the teaching assistants had the keys to the Holy of Holies in the basement where this thing was kept. But what I did see was plenty of these. Many of you know that this is how you program computers at the time. You take these thin cardboard cards, punch holes in them, and then this was your computer code. Well, a hole in a card is kind of hard to correct. Backspace doesn't exist. It was really interesting to try to generate a computer program and giving a few of these cards right the first couple of times. So it took a lot of cards to do it. Well, even using the key punch machine, this is actually a photograph of the key punch museum that's here in the museum. I had used an identical one to this, and it took a lot of tries to get the computer code right before it worked properly. Well, this got me to thinking lately, what did it take to actually, in this period of time, early 1960s, to generate a computer code, a program, and get it to work? Well, with the IBM 1620, you'd have to punch at least 10 or 20 cards to get a working program. It took maybe hours for the computer to generate the results and give it back to you. Well, the university would have had to spend at least $100,000 in 1962 dollars to get the 1620 to work. And what I did only 15 years later, I type a few lines on the computer, and yes, it did have a backspace, so it was easy to correct my errors. And got the results in a few seconds rather than a few hours. And I spent $2,000 versus $100,000 to do the same thing with the same code in Pascal, for example, that I was doing in my desk at home. So this was one of the significant things about the Apple II. Well, let me give you another example. And this one, let's just say, is out of this world. So if any of you are over 60 years old, you're fortunate. No, I'm really serious about this. because if you're over 60 years old, you probably spent the afternoon and evening of July the 20th looking at this on your TV set. I don't know how many episodes of Star Trek I watched in the 1960s. It had to be 75 or who knows. All of them were not nearly as exciting or as suspenseful as what you've just seen. So if you're fortunate enough to see it, you're lucky. Well, those of you who are the first time in the museum probably noticed that there's quite an exhibit out of the space race. And so this was pretty meaningful to me. And so I was considering, okay, what did this really mean to us from a computing point of view? Well, one of the aspects of the space capsules is that it needed a way to guide the space capsule to the moon and get it back again. It needed a guidance computer. The guidance computer that NASA used for this and the Apple II were almost the same data processing speed, about 20,000 flops. Now the term flops won't mean anything to most of you, but it's floating point operations per second. It's what we used to use to indicate computer speed. Now the Apollo guidance computer and the Apple II are just about the same size as well. But the difference in cost of the chips is astounding. So the AGC, or the guidance computer, was first designed in 1962, and this was just after the first integrated circuits were introduced by Fairchild and other companies. So I understand that NASA spent, for one guidance computer, had to spend about $200,000. They had a lot of these computers, so they spent a lot of money on integrated chips back in the early 60s. Well, the Apple II also has for the same processing power and the same size, it took maybe $500 worth of chips. So in 15 years, this was the kind of guidance, the type of progress that was made. Well, I was very interested as a chemist in what Armstrong and Aldrin did in breaking up the first moon rocks, because I did have a long interest in geology as well. In the 6th grade, I couldn't decide if I wanted to be a geologist, an astronomer, or an archaeologist. So I became a chemist. Go figure. Well, I was interested in this aspect of the moon landing. And so I was really fascinated when I read that one of the people that NASA had assigned to evaluate and analyze the first moon rocks was Melvin Calvin. Melvin Calvin was a PhD biochemist who was also a Nobel Prize winner in Berkeley. And he was really working on, do these things contain life or not? Now, just coincidentally, I read a book by Melvin Calvin about 3 months before the Apollo landing on the possible ways that you could possibly detect if life was there or not. Well, then 3 months about after the Apollo landing, I remember I saw something that said he would be giving a presentation on his plan for analyzing the moon samples. And he would be giving it in Tulsa, Oklahoma at an American Chemical Society meeting. Well, I lived in Oklahoma City at the time, so it was a no-brainer to hop in my car and drive the 2 hours from Oklahoma City to Tulsa to hear the presentation. Well, actually, I was driving a '69 Dodge Charger at the time, so it probably took me less than 2 hours to get there. But anyway, that's another story. His presentation was really interesting, and I was just fascinated and listened to every word. But I was astounded halfway through the presentation when he reached into his pocket and pulled out this. Here was a sample of the moon that he had in his hand that was right in front of me. And so he was telling everyone what he was doing with it. So here was moon dust right here, not up there, but right here. So I just couldn't believe it, so I listened intently. He got through his presentation. He asked if anybody wanted to stay afterwards to ask a few questions. I was there, I asked a few questions. He answered my question. He turned around, he took this out of his pocket, set it on the table, and talked to the next person. What did I do? Walked up to the table, picked it up. I'm holding a piece of moon in my hand. It was one of the most memorable things that I did that I shouldn't have done. But anyway, so this story has sort of an interesting postscript to it. About 13 years ago, they were cleaning out a main warehouse in Berkeley, and they found this in the back corner of the warehouse. These were the samples that Melvin Calvin was using to analyze the moon rocks. Yes, he was supposed to give them back to NASA, certainly, but somehow he didn't. I probably wouldn't have either. So there is a high probability that it was one of these samples that I held in my hand. Well, I've since read that only about 2,000 individuals have ever held lunar samples in their hand. Have actually worked with them. If you make a plot of how many people actually analyzed it and looked at it, I was probably at the head of this curve. Okay, so we've been talking about Apple computers and things that are sort of associated with it. But I wanted to give you an idea of the growth of data processing in scientific instruments at the time in the early 1960s and 70s. When I first started the working life in 1966 as a chemist, this was the instrumentation I worked with. Fairly simple instrument, measured the colors of light, to put it simply. The interesting thing about this is it did have one vacuum tube for amplification, but it did none of the data processing that I needed to do, what I needed to do. So it was, pencil and paper and pad, or my trusty post-Versalog slide rule that I absolutely loved and still have. I did most of my calculations with this. But actually there was one analysis I had to do during this first job where it needed more significant figures than I could do with a slide rule and many more calculations than I was willing to do by hand. So I had to use one of these. This is called a Marchant Multimatic, excuse me. DuPont Multimatic Desk Calculator. This was interesting in that even though it had 111 keys, not one of them was labeled backspace. To get through a whole series of calculations to generate what I needed to do with this calculator wasn't quite as bad as working with punch cards, but close, let me tell you. I really didn't like this thing. Well, at my next job, 2 years later, I started working with the instrumentation as a customer that I would be working with for the rest of my life as a working chemist. Started working with atomic spectroscopy instruments. this is what they looked like. Now these instruments had vacuum tubes, and but they did very few of the computations that we really needed to work with as working chemists. It did some of them, but not very many of them. So it was pencil and paper and laboratory notebooks and all of this. Well, worked with this instrument for 2 years, went to a new job, worked with the following model of the same instrument. So it looked like this, and it had integrated circuits, not vacuum tubes. So with the integrated circuits, they could do more sophisticated things, and things that I no longer had to do. You know, I used to have to plot calibration curves on graphs with pencil and paper. No longer had to do this with this instrument. It uses integrated circuits to do this for me. Well, I worked with this instrument for 2 years. I must have done a couple of interesting things with the instrument because Apple offered me a job. And so they said, why don't you come work with us in our product development laboratories. So I moved from Oklahoma City to Connecticut, where then I worked for this company for the next 37 years. Well, this is the instrument that I worked with after I was there for a couple of years in 1975. In 1975, we ditched the integrated circuits and replaced that with microprocessors. Here, this particular system did extensive processing within the instrument. Well, PerkinElmer was also a computer company, not just an instrument company. But the computers that we worked with were pretty sophisticated. They were certainly technically competitive with the IBM System 370s. And some of us began to think, well, maybe we ought to take our instruments here and download the data from the instrument to the computer and then further work with them on the computer. This sounded interesting and appealing. But eventually we figured out that this was not the right thing to do. This was the wrong thing to look at it. What we should do instead is consider the laboratory instrument as the main data processing point, transfer and tell the scientific instrument to collect the data, and once the data is collected, send it back to the scientific instrument. So this is our approach from then on. Well, the computers that we worked with at the time were far too expensive for this, so we had to develop something simpler. What we developed was something that was called the Model 360 Data Station. And so this was one of the first computers in sort of the format that we're now used to seeing as desktop computers. And so this was developed and introduced in 1975. So we were now using computers as adjacent to the instrument itself. So this is what an instrument system looked like in 1980 that this worked with. So the computer had its own microprocessor. The instrument had their own microprocessor as well. They all had to work together. It was actually somewhat interesting to think about how do you design a user interface on the computer to work with all of this at once. It was not an easy task, believe me, because I was doing it. Well, 2 years after this computer was introduced, IBM finally got with the program and introduced the Model 5150 that you could see outside the door here. But these computers were not quite powerful enough for what we needed to do, so we really couldn't use IBM or Dell computers for a couple of years till they became more powerful. Then finally, they were sufficient in operating power that then we could use them with our instrumentation. So if you take a look at the first 15 years after I started working, we started with pencil and paper and slide rule, then went to desktop calculators, then the instruments had vacuum tubes, then integrated circuits, microprocessors, and then finally desktop computers, all in 15 years worth of time. We've been doing the same thing ever since. Well, thinking about the model, the data station, the 3600 data station, reminded me of a time when I was at a meeting when I was asked a question that I just couldn't answer. I wanted to tell you a little bit about this. So, in 1984, I was invited to Beijing to give a series of lectures. So this is what Beijing felt like at the time. So Beijing had 10 million people at the time, and at any one moment in time, there were probably 10 million people on the street with bicycles. It was interesting. Now this is really an interesting photograph because it shows, the haze in the sky. It's really beautiful looking at it in a photograph. It was not beautiful trying to breathe it in. The smog was terrible. So I was there for 14 days, and there were 13 days of smog. One clear day in the whole time I was there. Well, the second day I was there, the head of PerkinElmer Beijing took me aside. He was an American who I happened to know quite well. He said, Richard, how would you like to help me teach an English class? Teach an English class? What do you mean? Well, he told me that every month he opened up a class for the local Chinese who were learning English and had Americans come speak to them so they can hear other voices, other pronunciations, other words told in a little bit different way. And so when he would have visiting people like me come in, he'd have them talk for 45 minutes or an hour just to give them a chance to hear. He said, well, that's what I tell the Chinese officials. What it really was is subtle diplomacy. Go in, tell them with a smile what you do, the freedom that you have, the kind of things that you do, the opportunities you have to make choices. Well, I did that, got through the 45 minutes of lecture fairly comfortably, threw it up open for questions at the end. There were a couple of interesting questions. One of the questions that was asked is that, well, I hear that people in your country actually have computers at home. Do you have a computer at home? So I said, no, I don't have a computer. I have 3 computers. So I had to tell them about the Model 360 I use for algorithm development, the IBM PC I use to generate reports, and the Apple II that I use, for better terms, for inspiration. Looked at my watch and said, well, there's probably time for one last question. Well, all evening I had noticed that there was an immaculately dressed gentleman sitting on the front row who was really listening hard and taking copious notes. He raised his hands. Here's a question. What role does PerkinElmer have in President Reagan's Star Wars program? How do I answer this? Well, sir, I'm only a junior chemist. I work in a small laboratory in a company in Connecticut. Yeah, we have 10,000 people working for PerkinElmer. We have facilities all over the world. I barely know what goes on in the lab right down the hall from me, much less what goes on in the rest of the company. Yeah, I really don't have any idea what you're talking about. In actuality, we were making the guidance optics for the lasers. Of course, I wasn't supposed to know this, but did. So how did I know this? Well, I was working with an engineer who had worked with this project the year before. And one evening, over cocktails, things got fluid. Let's just leave it at that. But we were making the optics for this Star Wars or Strategic Defense Initiative lasers. Well, I didn't have a security clearance at the time and wouldn't for about 15 years until I was director of research for PerkinElmer instruments, and so then I got one. So at that time, the Chinese government agent did not hear what he wanted to hear. Wonder what that agent would have thought if he would have also known that PerkinElmer made the optics for the most sophisticated spy satellites at the time, the Hexagon KH-9. PerkinElmer designed and manufactured all the optics for this premier spy satellite. But he didn't hear about it. Now, PerkinElmer also did other things that had to do with the space program. PerkinElmer also designed and manufactured the mass spectrometers that were used in the two Viking landers. So here you see Carl Sagan with a model of the Viking landers. So this was one aspect. Now, some of you who are of an engineering sense probably associate PerkinElmer's name with the Hubble Space Telescope, because we made the mirror for the Hubble, and yes, we made it incorrectly. That had to be fixed with a space shuttle program in the 1993. But that's another story I'm not going to get into. Fascinating one, but nonetheless. Wanted to tell you one more thing that happened. I think it was about 3 months before I got the Apple II in 1977. I took a trip to Palo Alto, California, visited the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. It was at Xerox when I was given a demonstration of this. You'll see one of these out in the hall too. This was the Alto. The Alto was a research project with Xerox that was far more sophisticated in graphical user interfaces than anything else around. Nothing else came close to it. So I saw this demonstrated, and I was just blown away by what the things that I saw. I was used to computer screens that had black and white, and nothing else but a series of numbers. Here I saw graphics on the screen, I saw text, I saw the different items in different parts of the screen that I could choose which one to view with this little thing that they were sliding along the table had some buttons in it. This, to me, was significant. How could I use this with the instruments we were developing? Well, on the airplane on the way home, I certainly developed a presentation for our engineering management. And basically I said, let's do a graphical user interface. Yes, we were an instrument company, but we were also a computer company and spy satellite company at the same time. So let's do a user interface and do the kind of things that I saw with the Alto computer. Well, what did the engineering management promptly say? No one will want it. Too much information on the screen at the same time. No one is really going to want to see this. And who in the world would want to take their hands off of the screen and run through this little thing and then put them back on and type again? No, we're not interested. Well, somebody was interested. 2 years after I saw the Alto, so did Steve Jobs. He saw it, and what happened? The Macintosh, of course, and a tremendous increase in revenue for Apple. PerkinElmer could have done this, but didn't. So if you take a look at the curve of the acceptance of graphical user interface, I was ahead of the curve. Okay, sometimes things work, sometimes they don't. Well, this will give you sort of a rough idea of the effect of the Apple II when we were first developing data processing for computers. And so to learning what could be done with it. Well, Steve Jobs said that he was also, if I'm Steve Jobs, I'm saying, I'm always keeping my eyes open for the next opportunity. I don't know what the next big thing will be, but I have a few ideas. And Steve Jobs certainly had a few ideas, didn't he? So if you're looking at new developments, new things to do with computer technologies, jump in with both feet and do it as well as you can. Now I use the Apple II for inspiration. So seek inspiration where you can, and to try to do a few things to extend the role of what you do. So basically, what you can do is be the curve and generate your own capabilities on this. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about some of the things at the Apple II and what it was like in the first years of developing technologies. Thank you.
That was an amazing presentation. If anybody has any questions, please raise your hand. I'll come to you with the microphone so the questions can be heard by the audience when we post this to YouTube. Any questions?
Do you remember how much you paid for that first Apple II? It's quite an investment at that time, I imagine.
It was, yeah, I paid $2,000 for it. You could buy Apple IIs for about $1,400 at the time, but I loaded it with as much memory as you possibly could and every accessory I could get with it. Now, I did it with my own money. It wasn't PerkinElmer's money, but I used it for PerkinElmer things because it seemed like the right thing to do.
Any other questions?
I can't remember, did it have,
Ooh.
I can't remember, did the Apple II have a graphical interface yet, or was that waited for the Mac?
No, it was graphical, but not sophisticated, because so some of the games were all graphics, by the way, but there were quite a few games for it, but not nearly as sophisticated as the Mac. But yes, there were a few. There's another question in the back.
And some of those games, they didn't have nearly as many games as some of the other computers, but I remember I had one. It was a paper airplane that you had to get through a house by using the vents.
I'm a huge fan of Apple and computers, so I was watching one of the interview with Steve Jobs
Yes.
on YouTube, and he was talking about visiting the Xerox office and how it changes the graphical interface, and how much they so before before they visited Xerox, everything was just like you say, DOS based,
Yeah,
just,
right.
dark screen and the numbers, letters, and everything. And then when they visited the office, they could see icons, icons and
Yeah.
easier, user friendly, and at the same time, they were trying to make mainframe computers personalized, just like our cell phone right now is very personalized. It's just
Yes.
like I wouldn't mind losing my wallet than my cell phone because it's so personalized. It's
Right.
so personalized. So how seriously they were working for, graphical interface during the time when they were trying to make computers personalize the PC.
Well, when I worked with a scientific instrument company, we weren't nearly as far along as Xerox was. Everything I saw just completely astounded me. That I thought we could use this, but then in practice, from an engineering standpoint, we weren't allowed to pursue it. But yeah, there's so much capability that I saw with the Xerox Alto that it was just astounding, that I was hoping that we could translate to our particular products, but was not able to for quite a few years. And we weren't able to till we started using IBM and Dell computers with our scientific instruments.
Here's one more in the back.
Did you do anything with modems with your Apple computer? I know that the growth of the Apple computer was followed very dramatically by the growth of Hayes modems.
Right.
And I worked with them at the time, and they were always tracking Apple sales and modem sales, because if you bought a personal computer, you wanted to talk to somebody else or
Right.
a bulletin board. This is before the internet,
Sure.
but it was the beginning of the curve on the internet also. So I
Yeah.
just wondered what your experience was with Apples and modems.
No, I never used a modem with the Apple. I used the Apple II pretty extensively for probably 5 years and a moderate amount after that. But I never did, of course I had modems at work, but I never did that at home. So I took some of the concepts that I worked with the Apple at home, took them to work and used them there. But no, it wasn't one of the things that I did.
Any other questions?
So we know you own the Apple II, and you have a MacBook Pro or a MacBook on the table right there. I'm curious, outside of the standard computers that we've all owned over the years, if in your personal technology, not at work, if there's any other specific computer that jumps out to you as a technological outlier that you're very fond of.
Fond of, I can't think of anything specific like this. Of course, I've used Apple computers. Well, after the Apple II, I used IBM computers for years after that until I finally got back into the Apple in 2000 or so. And but I can't think of anything specific like that. But the Apple II was really significant for me at the time. Because the Apple II was one of the three triumvirates that were big in 1977 with the Commodore PET and the TRS-80 and all of that. But the Apple II was the most significant for that. So no, nothing really specific as far as I could tell.
Another question in the back?
So I've got two questions, both related to your presentation, but not to the Apple. So the first one, so you mentioned on the post Verstalog your slide rule, and you certainly have tremendous experience with the slide rule. How many significant digits were you able to get to the right of the decimal? I've always wondered that. I have some slide rules. I'm not proficient with them, but someone like you who was a master of the post Verstalog, could you get three to the right of the decimal, or did you go further?
1.5 significant figures is about it.
Is about it. Okay.
That's what you can do.
Okay, great to know. I've always wondered that.
Yep.
Right.
That's true.
And then next question on the Xerox Alto. So Xerox never sold any of those computers. They
No.
used them internally.
Right.
They built over 1,000, and but they were only primarily used within Xerox. But they did give a significant number of them away to some of their folks that they thought would use them. Was PerkinElmer ever offered to be given an Alto? Or when you were doing your demo, was there ever discussion related to that? I know that some were given to the government, and a few others were given to a few of their select customers, but none were ever sold. They were mostly used within Xerox's own internal operations.
No, as far as I'm aware, PerkinElmer never had one. So no, didn't have it.
Understood. Yeah, it's stunning the history that it provides.
Yeah.
I mean, Ethernet was developed by
Right.
Palo Alto Research Center, the
Right.
mouse, object-oriented programming,
Yeah.
all those things, and they didn't capitalize on any of it, which is quite
Right.
remarkable. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Any last questions? All right. Well, I want to thank you all for coming out today on not the greatest of weather this morning, but I think it's supposed to clear up and unfortunately then get cold again. Welcome to February in Atlanta, right? But I do want to invite you out next month for our Talking Tech. Our speakers will be coming from Southern Area Rocketry, and they'll be discussing 100 years of rocketry. It's the anniversary of Robert Goddard's first fueled launch. And so that will be on March the 14th, Pi Day. And so that should be great, 2 o'clock, probably this room or the next room. But please join us at that time. And can we give one more very warm thank you to our speaker, Richard, today. Thank you so much, everybody.